Before I started doing this professionally, I probably thought that the VC quality curve was like two humps, like a big hump in terms of really, really bad people who just mess up your company and are horrible folks. And at the other end, like an equally big hump of people who are just kingmakers. And when I got into the industry, not surprisingly, I realized that the distribution curve was like a little bit more of a normal curve. Most folks are just like smart, well-intended people trying to do their job. And they are going to be neutral to slightly positive for you. But at the end of the day, you as the founder have like a much greater degree of agency and control over whether you actually succeed or not. I always think venture capitalists talking about the size of their funds is like bragging about your fitness by how many calories you consume. Like it's the output, not the input. We found that the venture capital business model was getting in the way of the work we wanted to do versus supporting it. And so we decided rather than change the work, we decided to change the business model. So it happens to be Homebrew 4 is the name of the fund that we self-funded. And so the way I think of it is it's Homebrew 4 ever, because it's an evergreen vehicle that we will be investing out of together for the rest of our lives.
Hunter Walk is a legend in the product space, building products like AdSense, YouTube, reaching billions of people and billions in revenue. Hunter is a legend, and at one point decided to turn investor. And we're talking today about the hardest parts of building a venture firm, why he decided to turn from builder to investor, and also his journey to more self-fulfilling work. Because what I realized throughout the interview is that it took him a decade each to strip apart a layer and say, hey, I don't like this anymore, so I'm changing up things. Because when we talk about Homebrew, Homebrew started as a typical venture firm in quotation marks for the first 3 funds, but the 4th fund generation is an evergreen vehicle only with the money of Hunter and his co-founder / general partner, founding partner, Satya. So it's not the typical fund anymore. And we're talking about this in this episode. So thank you so much for tuning in. You're listening to Unicorn Bakery, in which we are trying to decode how great founders are building companies, how investors like Hunter, who are also building companies like a venture firm, are sharing tactical insights on actually building. No fluff, no boulevard. It's very much about the real insights and tactics on building. So if you don't want to miss an episode or have a friend who should listen to the podcast, feel free to subscribe and share the episode. My name is Fabian Tausch, and here's Hunter Walk, founding partner of Homebrew. Hunter, welcome to the Unicorn Bakery.
Thanks so much for having me.
I would love to understand at first, there's so much we need and should talk about, but you've been a builder for a very long time. Google, lots of responsibility for products that are now reaching billions of people, generating lots of revenues. And at some point, you decided, hey, I'm turning my back on being a builder. What changed? What inflection point was there for this, in quotation marks, but maybe not even in quotation marks, identity change?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And it's funny because when you say identity change, I'm going to hit, I think this year, middle of this year, it'll be about as many years doing Homebrew and, sort of venture capital as I spent as a product manager. But I still very much consider my identity to be a product manager, even though that's not the way most people think of me now. It's sort of the, maybe it's the formative years of tech. So I guess I'd say leaving that behind and moving into what we're doing now was actually 2 decisions, not one. And I think the first was independent of what I did next. Was I kind of done with being part of org charts? And I think about that differently from being done with building. I was reaching a point in my career when I was running product at YouTube where, that you talked about, product management is 2 words, right? And it turns out that I really loved the first word and didn't love the second word as much. I loved being hands-on with the team, with users, and figuring out how and what to build. I liked the management part less and less, at least as Google and YouTube got bigger and bigger. And so after about a decade at Google, I was, thinking about leaving, and I had this question, am I done, right? Like that's a pretty fundamental question. Not done with working, but like done with the idea of managing people and being managed by someone else. And that was the question I was wrestling with. And I was going to, leave at the beginning of 2013 regardless and take 2013 and maybe just angel invest. I'd been doing some of that, continuing to build some side projects with friends and, blog and, go to conferences, whatever, stay part of the conversation, but like not jump right into the next thing. And that I figured would give me enough time to figure out whether I was truly, done operating, or whether I was just overreacting to, a decade at a very large, fast-growing company where I needed to take a step back, exhale before I jump back in. I didn't have that year, right? So 2013, I didn't get my year of, my year of exploration, because what happened then, and this the second decision, was my friend and now sort of co-founder Satya Patel left Twitter, where he'd been running product as well. Now, the connection between myself and Satya was we sat about 5 feet apart from one another for the better part of 4 years during the early to mid 2000s when we were both working on AdSense at Google. When he left there to go back to venture before joining Twitter, we always knew we wanted to work together again. And we needed a blank sheet of paper moment. I think anybody, I know a lot of founders listen to this. There's the difference between, friendships and co-founders where one of you decided to do something and then convinced the other to do it with you versus, hey, we just know we want to work together. Let's take a blank sheet of paper and figure it out. And frankly, that was the second decision. What we ended up writing on that blank sheet of paper turned into Homebrew. But neither one of us was intending to build a venture firm together, or even as individuals thinking about doing venture next. It was, very much sort of, hey, if we don't take advantage of this opportunity to work together, who knows when it'll happen again? So, let's prioritize that. And Homebrew was born from that at sort of the end of 2012, beginning of 2013.
Super interesting when people ask me, and this podcast is not about myself, but when are you building your own venture? Are you planning on doing something? And I'm like, on the one hand, right now, I don't have the topic and the problem that I want to tackle. And on the other hand, I might just jump right into it if I had the right people around me that I actually really, really want to build with. And then I'll find something. But for now, I'm very good with where I'm at. And so therefore I know, or I'm looking forward to the feeling of like, hey, I would love to build something with this specific person, especially because I'm building alone at the moment when we talk about the podcast and everything around it. But from a co-founder perspective, there's none. But it's interesting. I can understand that feeling.
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously a whole story we can talk about as to like why Homebrew and how did you come to that and how's it changed. And I'm sure we'll get more into that. But it was really as simple as the two of us wanted to work together again. And so we started talking about, one, do we really want to do that? Right? Like, hey, I still want to work hard. Do you want to work hard? Sort of a bunch of like values, conversations. And then how would we want to spend our time together and so on and so forth. And that led us to venture rather than the idea of like, oh, we should start a venture capital firm. Well, okay, well, like, what would that firm do? Like, what stage do you want to invest in? It was very much, we backed into it in a way that I think was very pure and has always informed, hopefully, I think is tangible to the entrepreneurs we back because we know who we are and we know what we stand for and we know what we do and we know what we don't want to do. But it's also informed the, sort of changes and strategic decisions we've made along the way to the firm itself. Venture capital loves to sort of, do a lot of content marketing, talk about how wonderful it is to, I always think venture capitalists talking about the size of their funds is like bragging about your fitness by how many calories you consume. Like it's not, it's, it's the output, not the input. And I don't put venture or specifically us, on a pedestal. I think, we exist to serve entrepreneurs and, that's the way that we've always sort of, thought and felt about it. But I've been doing it for a while now.
One important thing when we talk about bigger decisions in life is like, how did you come to them? You said you liked product more than the management part, and it became a bit more management, or maybe not even just a bit more management, but
A lot more management, yeah.
what were the parts that informed the decision besides, because for many people it's like, yeah, it's a bit too much management, but it's not that bad, so why would I
Yeah,
leave yet? So making bigger decisions and such
absolutely.
step changes is more than just like, yeah, I just a little bit of this, I don't like that.
I've been very fortunate, to not actually make that many career decisions in my life. I worked at I came out to the Bay Area for grad school in 1998. I finished that up in 2000. I joined a startup called Linden Lab that built a virtual world called Second Life that's still around. I was there for its first 3 years, and then I joined Google for about 10 years before starting Homebrew. So I really haven't, I've worked on a few products at a few companies. Um, and part of that has been, I think, sort of making good choices, like knowing what I'm looking for and what's going to make me happy. And part of that has been an interest and willingness to not just bail when things get hard or when you had a bad month. Because I think part of product management and part of what matters to me is sort of not just the start, but the end. Like you're there for a phase of something. If you inherited a product or whether it's a 0 to 1 phase, the 1 to 2 phase, the whatever, you're there for the chance and the ability to take something, make it better, and then hand it off to the next person. So the challenge, if you've made if you've made a bad decision, if you're at a company that, isn't run the way you hoped it would be, or doesn't succeed, or the person you're working for, doesn't give doesn't care about you, then sometimes those are easy. You need to leave and go to somewhere that, is better than that. But if you're in a good situation, it's sometimes like the hardest thing, as you point out, is leaving because, especially at these large tech companies, you're probably pretty well paid, right? So you're, likely not sort of unhappy financially. Um, you, how to get work done, and the people around you are generally competent. And so, there's always progress. There's always progress. Some of your identity becomes tied to, being a Googler in my case, or things like that. And so anytime you sort of have to give that up, change that, to step and do something else, it can be emotionally transitional. But I also think all those things are traps, right? If you sort of judge by well, I'm only going to go somewhere that I can make more money, work with people I know, doing something I know how to do already, and there's a brand that's, well known to my family and friends, like you'll just keep shuttling between, like Meta, Google and, OpenAI now, I guess, or something, right? And like, there's certainly people who do that. You look at their careers and they sort of do, anywhere from short to medium term stints at companies that have already built themselves, already scaled, and they have a very good life. But I knew that what I wanted to do was to always be at places where I could not just ride the curve, but potentially inflect it, right? How can you make a difference on what's being built? How can you, what's being done differently because you're there versus would be done anyway and you're just there to help out? And so for me, that was always about phases of companies. Can I be there early enough to make an impact? But, I was never a founder. I guess I founded Homebrew, but I was never the founder of of an operating company because I didn't think, it turns out that I didn't want to be a CEO. I didn't want to be the, zero that start at zero. I wanted to start at maybe, 0.25 in the case of Second Life, or, start at 1. 0 to 1 was the original YouTube team. And then I came on to help from sort of the 1 to 10. And so I guess to sort of try to sum it up, I think, one, people should avoid the trap of what I'm doing is good enough. They should not worry about they should shift their focus on the idea of what they want to optimize for in order to, sort of break the frame of things are good enough. Well, not if you're trying to optimize for something else. Things are good enough if you're trying to make money and trying to, know which office you go to every day. Things are not good enough if you're trying to build something that doesn't exist. If you want to work in a different industry, if you want to optimize for something else in your life, well, then your current situation isn't the status quo. It's something to, start to leave behind. And I also think you also should never avoid things you're afraid of or that make you uncomfortable. Obviously, when I say that, I mean uncomfortable in the sense of nervous about your ability to perform, fear of failure, that type of stuff, not compromise your values or think something might be, wrong or a little bit off. And that, I think if you do that, at the very least, you'll make a lot of good decisions. And some of those decisions will be good outcomes, right? But I think technology and Silicon Valley culture is about the repeated game of good decisions. And then, the power law of good outcomes, right? Not everything you do will succeed to the same scale, but if you continue to make good decisions, you'll have some successes that so outstrip the others that they start to open other doors or enable, other things in your life. And that's what I would urge people, whether they're, just starting out their career, midway through their career, or, sort of taking a few last swings and want to make sure they do some things that they hadn't tried before. That's my perspective, at least.
So, as I'm sure there are people listening right now who are in a situation where they're like, yeah, I could imagine, for example, doing a career change, or what I can imagine even more are listening to finally make the jump and say, hey, I want to build something and now is the time to do so. What would be your words and advice for potential founders who are thinking, should I do it? Shouldn't I?
Yeah. So I have my own biases, right? Like, and it's wonderful. There's like the old, parable of a bunch of blind men, each feeling different parts of the elephant. And depending upon which part you're feeling, you think it's a different animal. If you're feeling the tail, you think if it's a rat. If you feel the trunk, you think it's, what do you think it's a giraffe? Whatever it is, it's something like that. I'm messing it up, but you get the general idea. Tech is so big now, and there's so many different types of companies being founded, so many different types of founders that, my answer is just the part of the elephant I touch, right? I can't get my arms around the whole elephant. And so there's so many different reasons to start a company. There's so many different examples of people who've done things and been successful. I'll give you my bias. I think that you should start something, if one or more of a handful of conditions are true. One, there is somebody you really want to work with, who you just think is an amazing partner, an amazing co-founder. And, it's the right time for the two of you or three of you to try something. And that, time for some reason is perishable. That person, will otherwise go take a different job, or, the moment of where your skills are really complementary, might change over time, or things like that. So, it's person. Who are you going to do this with? Now, again, there's plenty of amazing solo founders. We've backed some amazing solo founders. So it's not a requirement, but I think it's certainly a catalyst. There's an idea or a problem that you can't stop thinking about. You want to see solved, and you don't think other people would solve it the same way you would. So it's not even just sort of there's a business opportunity, or there's a sprint, to a consensus future that you think you can win that sprint. I believe you have to have like a real interest to the problem, the issue you're solving. At least one of you, not the whole founding team and not the whole team, but like one of the founders needs to really care about the problem in a way that I almost think gives them an advantage, in terms of they have earned insights. They understand the problem more than just surface level depth, and they're willing to commit 10 years of their life to it. I think that's important from a leadership standpoint. I think it's important from a strategy standpoint. I also think it helps from sort of a durability standpoint. Startups are hard. They have their ups and downs. I think you need something more than a net present value calculation to keep you doing it. Um, and then the third would be, you think that the sum total of what you've accomplished so far in your life, or the resources you have available to you, and sometimes that resource is just time. You're young, it's pre-family, you can really throw yourself at it, but you have some competitive advantage that gives you the right to win. Now, each of those has, sort of uh, opposite and equal, sort of stories you can tell, right? Solo founders, you can put a great team around them. Folks who, of course, they care about what they're building, but they care much more about the strategy, operations, the team building. They're not necessarily mission-driven founders in the sense of they're picking a problem that they really care about, but they're picking, an opportunity that they believe is interesting and love the act of company building. Amazing founders that way. And then, the third, in terms of the advantage, like, the advantage is the speed with which they build, the network with which they can pull from. It's not necessarily that they, have studied, machine learning for 10 years when all of a sudden there's a breakthrough in, machine learning technology. So like I said, it's just the part of the elephant. But for me, it's about that. It's about the people you want to work with, the problem you want to work on, and what gives you the advantage or right to win. And if all those things are clicking, like, you got to go do it. You can't convince yourself that, well, if I spend just 3 more years at this big company, I'll have more savings that will make it easier, or I'll have more credibility when I go to fundraise, or, I'll know more people to hire. Like, all those things are true, but, you can't, sometimes they can be true, but still lead you down the wrong path, which is, waiting too long. And then you find out that you sort of never did it. I had a friend who has since started a company that I backed as an angel, so I'm incredibly proud of him. But I remember when he worked for me back at YouTube, he told me he wanted to be an entrepreneur at some point. and that this was, his hero was, I think maybe at the time was Elon Musk. And, this was a decade or so ago. And, and, but he was going to spend, another 3 years, 5 years, whatever at Google before he started his company, because he thought like that would give him the stability, the learning, so on and so forth. And I was like, hey, total respect if you want to do that, but I will point out like a little bit of inconsistency here. I don't think that's what your hero/role model would do, right? Like you just told me like this is your true north, person. Like it doesn't seem to be the type of dude who would say, well, let me spend another 3 to 5 years at a safer place, doing something I already know how to do before I decide to jump into that other thing that is scary and interesting. So I'm like, maybe you should, for at least today, be a little bit more like Elon. That meant something very differently, 10 to 15 years ago. But, so that's my advice. Everybody sort of has their journey. And at some point, if you're going to start something, like you got to take that leap. And you'll never be 100% ready. And if you think you're 100% ready, either you don't know what you're getting into fully because, or you are supremely confident. Nobody I've backed, I would say, is like, feels they're always 100% ready, but they do it.
You took the leap in 2013. So now it's like 12 years ago. So what would you say is the hardest part about building a venture firm? And we're talking about the specifics about Homebrew and why it's like not a typical venture firm anymore, but what is the hardest part about establishing a venture firm?
Yeah, it's funny. I got the Homebrew logo tattooed on my shoulder shortly after we founded because I wanted to remember, I said before about, I believe in this sort of framework of separating the quality of decision from the quality of outcome and being focused on making good decisions. And I wanted to remind myself, whether it was something that lasted, unfortunately, just maybe a few months or lasted the rest of my life. And thankfully, it seems like it's going to last the rest of my life. The firm, the tattoo was going to last the rest of my life regardless. I had no choice on that. But I wanted to capture the start. And so, when Satya and I were talking about Homebrew and what we wanted to be and, sort of how we would decide whether it was, at any given point kind of worth doing, after having made the original decision, we sort of came to this decision that, well, there's some people who are proud of their work in this industry, but are not good at their job in the sense of they actually are not good investors. They don't make money, for themselves maybe they make money for themselves. They're collecting fees, but they don't make money for their LPs if they're using other people's money. And we said, well, if we are that, then we won't necessarily have the right to continue. Like if we're just doing great work for the founders we've backed, but, by and large, we're not able to produce economic returns, we won't have the right to do this, for the next few decades, at least, in terms of other people wanting to sort of fund us to do so. And then on the other hand, if we are economically successful, but not proud of the work we do for founders. So let's say we're just, good enough guys to get lucky on a few things or catch the crumbs off of, the big firms deals or things like that. If we're economically sustainable, but not proud of the work we're doing, then we wouldn't want to continue this, right? Like there's no reason to, in our mind, to, sort of get paid for something we're not proud of. And so let's hold ourselves to account, at the intersection of that Venn diagram. For Homebrew to exist long-term, we have to be both economically successful and sustainable and proud of the work we do. And that was sort of like our guiding principle, right? Like from there, we were able to make a whole bunch of other decisions about what stage do you want to invest in, what types of founders do you want to be the preferred choice for, you can't be all things to all people, different questions about growth and so on and so forth. So that was the hardest question on our end. I think the hardest question that we had to figure out in terms of then taking that product to market was, do founders want and need our product SKU, right? Like if you think of yourself as a product, I come with, a check, I come with, some help. There's more, in 2013, there were fewer choices, but still plenty. In 2023, 2024, 2025, what has that number grown? 10x or more choices, for founders. And so I think the reality is that any investor needs to ask themselves is, for enough founders, am I one of their top 3 choices? And, and if so, how many of those, founders can I meet, find, invest in? And what size firm, what strategy does that lead to? As opposed to like raising to a sum of money and then trying to commit that, as opposed to just like picking a point in the market but that you want to participate in, but not really asking yourself, well, how am I competitive enough to beat the other people, who are investing at that area? I think a lot of VCs stay in business without being excellent, and I think the founders benefit most when the VCs who want to stay in business also want to be excellent.
What would you say if I'm a founder and evaluating an investor? How do I find out if the VC has the tendency to be excellent and wants to be it? What will be your advice?
Yeah, and the reality is, like, I don't, before I started doing this professionally, I probably thought that, the VC quality curve was like two humps, like a big hump in terms of really, really bad people who just, mess up your company and are horrible folks. And at the other end, like an equally big hump of people who are just kingmakers. And if they get on your board or your cap table, like they can help you succeed to the extent that, you're going to be the next unicorn or whatever. And when I got into the industry, not surprisingly, I realized that the distribution curve was like a little bit more of a normal curve. Most folks are just like smart, well-intended people trying to do their job. And they are going to be, neutral to slightly positive for you. But at the end of the day, you as the founder have like a much greater degree of agency and control over whether you actually succeed or not than your investors can help you or harm you. And then there are a few, there's 5% on one end who are, sort of, I'd say, people that we don't want to be in business with. But that's not necessarily even because they're, sort of bad people. It's just sometimes their, incentives, the situation they're in at their firm, their whatever insecurities they have, I think make them sort of like less predictable, less long-term focused, less helpful for entrepreneurs. And we try to avoid those folks and steer them the other way. And then there's, 5% at the end of like highly self-aware, really good at what they do. And part of the special nature, I think, of those 5% is they also know when they're at their best, what situations they'd like to invest in. They're very good at picking the spots and the entrepreneurs that they do think they can be valuable, rather than believing that, they can be equally good consumer and enterprise investors, equally good seed and growth investors. So, they have tailored themselves to, um, you know, uh, who and where they work with. And so to your question as a founder, well, if I'm trying to, best case scenario, find, attract, work with one of those folks who's going to be the sort of 5% best fit for my company, what can I do? I think you always talk to other founders, right? The founders who have worked with that investor before, both companies that were successful and companies that maybe were not as successful, are going to give you the best sense of, how that person uh, helped, how that person behaved in situations that were tougher, for them as an investor, and ultimately, did that relationship transcend the company? Did the founder feel like that person was investing in the company, or were they investing in them as a founder? And where did that support come from? And then to the extent that those responses match kind of the similar stage of your company, and like, great. That person is probably going to be, so long as their head is still in the game and they're still doing it full time and, haven't lost their fire, their edge, whatever, that person is probably a great fit for you. But, you don't always have a chance to pick from that 5%, at least not every round. And so I'd say what you're really doing is you're just trying to use you're treating your cap table like your org chart. You're building a team of people who fill different roles and needs, and overall are going to be, useful to you in some way. But you're not, your company is not made and not broken, often by the nature of the investor on the cap table. It's, made and broken by, the founders and the team you build, and, the market you're working in.
From your own experience, what were like how easy or how hard was it to focus on the long-term building of, hey, we want to be in the top three, rather than in an economy where everything went louder and louder and the volume is turned up every day by some other player? Also staying in your own lane and saying, hey, we don't believe that this is the best approach. We're staying in our lane. We're focused. We're building Homebrew for mid and long-term success, without and maybe sacrificing, in quotation marks, the short-term a little because we're not trying to be the loudest and the best and the proudest and everything?
Look, I'll be honest with you. It got hard. So from 2012, 2013 until 2022, we raised three funds: Homebrew 1, Homebrew 2, Homebrew 3, from a small group of outside investors, mostly university college endowments, charitable endowments, some of the larger fund of funds, people we really enjoyed being in business with. And so we always loved our LPs. It was never about, sort of any changes we made to our fund structure weren't about fundraising. They were about fund deploying, like what happens once you get that money. In Fund 1, I think we hit the timing really nicely. It was, seed was still sort of this weird space that you had some dedicated firms doing and you had the larger firms dipping in and out of, but there was more supply of great founders looking for seed capital than there was, demand from great seed founders, and there necessarily was like supply of seed capital. And that changed dramatically over the next decade. And by the time we were investing out of our third fund, we felt, went from sort of, let's call it wind at our back to no wind to headwinds. So as a firm, even though we had reached the point where we had, maybe even a better reputation than when we started out because more people knew us and we had more logos of great companies we'd invested in and, so on and so forth, we were actually feeling the challenges increase to remaining a top 3 choice for somebody. And we had to ask ourselves the question, well, what do we want to do about that? Do we want to focus thematically, take some of the areas that we know we've done the best work in, fintech, applied, AI, machine learning, computer vision, horizontal vertical SaaS, and basically say, for all intents and purposes, we're now a vertical fund. These are the verticals we look in, sort of pull back a little bit off the generalist. Do we want to, and do we need to increase in size? All of a sudden, most of our peers, forget even the multi-billion-dollar funds, even our peer seed funds had double, tripled, quadrupled in size since when we started, where we had grown much more modestly. So do we now need to go from being a $95 million fund to a $200 million fund with all the sort of team operational overhead, that required to support that, as well as the different math in terms of what success looks like, and starting to get into the same narrative of, well, unless it's a $10 billion outcome, it really doesn't move the needle for us, that type of stuff, which I think, ultimately creates distance between you and the entrepreneur, especially during the early days when everybody's trying to sort of do the best work to figure out what this company is versus, just pump it full of helium and get it to its next funding round. And as you pointed out, like I forget whether I used the word noise or you used the word the noise, like the content marketing organs of our industry, went on full blast. So everybody loved being, a pundit, an event host, a podcast host, a blogger, a talking head, so on and so forth. And, they were all saying versions of the same thing more or less, but it became because everyone's firm was becoming more and more similar, they sort of had to differentiate themselves with words versus actions, which I don't think is helpful for entrepreneurs, or I don't think it's helpful for our industry. And, to a certain extent, we've always spoken our voice, spoken our values, but we didn't want to participate in any of that. And so we decided that actually the best way to remain in the top 3 choice for the entrepreneurs we wanted to work with was not to change the way we worked, but it was to change our business model, to basically switch from being the type of investor who only co-leads seed rounds to an investor that has a more flexible check size. Basically, you can think about it as we're now a puzzle piece that fits into many, many puzzles, as opposed to having one type of puzzle piece where we're looking for the puzzles where that piece fits. And we made that change. We talk more about that, sort of in 2022. And I think it's been great. We found that the venture capital business model was getting in the way of the work we wanted to do versus, supporting it. And so we decided, rather than change the work, we decided to change the business model.
You definitely know how to tell a story, because now everybody wants to know what changes you made. So what's the Homebrew 2.0?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny enough, when Satya and I started back in 2012, 2013, we had this idea. We said, Homebrew is going to be 5 funds, 20 years, and then we're going to switch to a model where we are our own funders, which is to say, we're not going to stop. We're not going to work for 20 years and then stop. In year 2021, something like a year number 20, year number 21, something like that, we will eventually just use our own money, our own capital to fund Homebrew. We put that under, maybe it's called, we put it under a box and say, get that box out in 20 years. Well, that was the box we ended up getting out in 2022 and opening up. Hopefully it wasn't, Pandora's box or something. But we basically said, hey, look, if we don't want to get much bigger, as I just talked about, not wanting to grow to be the $250 million fund that a lot of our friends were raising, let alone the multi-billion-dollar funds, maybe we should get smaller. And if we get smaller, like, why wouldn't we just use our own money? I think VCs would tell you there's plenty of reasons not to use your own money. First, you don't get a salary. You don't get management fees for your own money. Nobody pays you to invest your own money. So at the very least, we were switching from a model that could have paid us, millions of dollars a year if we just kept raising funds, to putting our own capital at risk. That's an economically stupid decision for the majority of venture capitalists, right? And it is an economically negative one for us, but a risk that we are comfortable taking, a sacrifice we are comfortable taking. The second reason that a lot of people don't like doing that is they want to be able to, go $100 million deep into a company, by themselves before somebody else would be, some of these people like to really be gunslingers. Like, I want to, if I believe in this nuclear fusion company, I want to be able to write a $100 million check into it, and obviously we can't write $100 million checks from our bank account, but we do have access to and retain access to sort of our old investors. So there's situations where if we need to augment our own capital with, sort of an SPV or something, we have access to that. So we felt like that was a risk taking. And then the third thing that's why some people don't do it is they really like building. They've either inherited, a firm, or they're building a firm that they like training the next generations of investors as employees. We felt like it was less interesting for us to train the next generations of investors and employees, and more interesting to help the next generation of firms like Homebrew get off the ground. So around the same time, we started a fund of funds called Screen Door, where we're actually helping to, and which now is a full-time team of 3, we're actually backing the next generation of VCs and trying to pay forward some of the wisdom. But that's fundamentally sort of the trade-offs and why most people don't go down the path we did. It's economically more risky. It sort of forces you to really be clear about the amount of money you're putting into companies, because it's not this sort of well of other people's money you can just pull from, and you sort of trade off maybe a little bit of the mentorship coaching aspect of it. We just found a different way to do it. We still invest in 10 to 12 companies a year. We kept our small team together. We still do seed. We're just mostly writing now $100,000 to $500,000 checks instead of, $1 to $3 million checks, although we can go larger and or later. And it's been an absolute joy. I think the challenges, besides the economic ones, we are dependent and excited about outcomes rather than collecting management fees, is can we still build and maintain these great relationships with founders when we're not their largest investor? When you're somebody's largest investor, there's a structural reason for you all to talk, spend time together, so on and so forth. I feel it's like in some ways even more pure now, in the sense of we have to earn their time and attention in order to be helpful. But it's different. It's a different muscle memory. It's more, I sort of think of it like being sort of being an angel investor who just has the sort of experience and gravitas and sort of full-time nature of a VC. And that's what Homebrew is now. It's you'll like this. I'll put on my marketing hat. So it happens to be Homebrew 4 is the name of the fund that we self-funded. And so the way I think of it is it's Homebrew forever, because it's an evergreen vehicle that we will be investing out of together for the rest of our lives.
You're right. I love this. From an outside perspective, it looks like after pretty much a decade, you will find something that stands between you and the next level of self-fulfillment. After 10 years at Google, pretty much, you didn't like the management aspect that much anymore. You wanted to have a new role, which was then Homebrew, becoming a VC because of the partnership with Satya. And then after pretty much 9 to 10 years of Homebrew, you realized, okay, the typical VC model is not exactly what we want to do. We love the work, but not in the current style. So we're improving that and ripping apart the things that we don't like and leave them behind us. And it sounds like a journey towards more self-fulfillment once in a while.
I do think so. I think it's very important to me, and this is more of something I've realized, only in my later adulthood than my early adulthood, was that what is most sustainable for me and when I do my best work is when I can sit at the intersection of joy, happiness, joy or happiness, and let's call it professional success. I used to think that somehow being happy or fulfilled or joyful would dull me, would actually work, against professional success. I needed a certain degree of uh, sort of, focus, commitment, that translated also into sometimes even insecurity and desperation, in order to do my best work. And I think for short bursts, that's true. But I do think long term, you ultimately need, the metaphor people say dirty fuel versus clean fuel. Like dirty fuel is like just having, nothing but a chip on your shoulder. And clean fuel is being highly competitive, being somebody who understands the urgency of the moment, who works very hard, but who ultimately like believes in what they're building in, believes in how they're doing it, and like can take moments of joy along the way. And I think, Satya has taught me that. And I think, therapy has taught me that. And that's, very important to us at Homebrew. In some ways, I think we made the decision we made it, much more, even though you change something and usually think changes bring risk. I think in this case, changes brought certainty. Like it's much more certain we're going to be doing this for the rest of our lives when we know that we can pop up, every once in a while and re-examine from a first principle standpoint, like, you know, what would we change? What do we want to change? How do we want to do this differently? And that is, that's like, there's nothing better than that, right? I definitely, I say love in your heart, but a chip on your shoulder. I do think that if you only have a chip on your shoulder, you sort of end up becoming toxic. If you only have love in your heart, you're too soft, right? Like our industry requires motivation, requires a little bit of willingness to be uncomfortable, willingness to upset the status quo, willingness to make some people mad at you, right? Like, but if you're just one or just the other. So whether it's people I back, people who, I look to hire, people who I want to work with, it tends to be some combination of like love in your heart, but a chip on your shoulder. And so for me, the love in our heart, my love in my heart is I love working with Satya. I love working with founders. The chip on my shoulder is I want those founders to win in the market. And I also think the venture industry is pretty mediocre. And so I want to see it continue to get better. And that combination, sort of leads to Homebrew.
If I'm starting out in venture, what would you say are a few things that I could do that would set me apart from the mediocre, knowing that it's a long-term business and I can't be exceptional from day one?
Yeah. So I think there's like a foundation of just good hygiene. You have to basically, be a good, try to be a good communicator, try to be a good relationship builder, try to be, somebody who understands like the fundamental physics of the business, which is, the economics sort of, determine a lot of behaviors and the incentives determine a lot of behaviors. So you need to understand all that because otherwise, you won't be able to understand, anticipate, or sort of work with people who are sort of guided by those sorts of principles. But then I think you have to pick out something that is, pick a superpower. And you pick a superpower that's either, if you're working at somebody else's firm, you pick a superpower that's valuable to the partner you're working for. And if you're on your own, you pick a superpower that's valuable to founders in a repeatable motion. And hopefully you have the time, energy, and ability to have at least one of each of those. One that's sort of, important to the team that you're a part of, and one that's important repeatability to founders. Now you can imagine that those could be any sorts of things. What's important within the firm you're working on? You could be the best, data analysis person. You could have the strongest network to a set of engineering schools that you think produce high quality founders and team members, but aren't as well covered as, Stanford and whatever. You could be the expert on an industry of an emerging piece of technology that, folks are trying to get their hands around, and be sort of the person who sort of understands, explains, to partners working on different industries how that's going to, change their industry. Founder facing, all those things are still valuable. You could be a great recruiter. You could be somebody who has amazing sense of marketing, branding, and communications, and build all the relationships with the press and the podcasters and so on and so forth, and help those companies get coverage. So I don't think it's best athlete. I don't think it's being, sort of B plus A minus in everything. I think it's having enough of the standard understanding of the business to be able to anticipate, predict, and influence how situations occur, and then one or two things that are useful and repeatable. And if you can do that for, a handful of a few years, you start to build the brand, the reputation, and the founder network that become sort of, almost self-fulfilling for the next set of years. And then you just have to make sure that when you're a decade in, you haven't outgrown the skill set, the network, and, aren't becoming, there's almost a success, in this industry, I feel like there's a backward bending curve of success, where when you're too successful, you end up spending all your time with consensus thinkers, people who are also successful, who are also at the same stage of their career. You sort of age out of contrarianism, and you age out of a network. And I think the best investors who have stayed um, agile, as they age, either know how to hire, for that sort of contrarian non-consensus beliefs, and or sort of break and rethink their thesis, you know, like you said, every fund cycle, every decade or so. I think like Fred Wilson at USV is an amazing example of that, where not only has he, sort of built a firm, but I think he himself, has approached each phase of technology and innovation and venture with sort of, some beliefs that are consistent and some beliefs that adapt to the time. And that's why he can be in, sort of have been in both like Twitter and Coinbase, type of stuff, and not just have sort of still be living off of the things he invested in, in the 2010s. He's a role model for me to that extent.
I'm talking to Albert Wenger next week, as the German connection also helps out doing that. So a bit of insights into USV next week then.
Yeah, they're definitely, I always say I don't have mentors. I don't have like weird parasocial relationships with like, I don't stan anybody, but I do have role models. And even those role models don't have to be perfect role models. They don't have to be people who I want to, or who I feel a match with in every part of my life and every part of their life. But I do think it's important to like be able to look towards people who you think, make decisions or have, conducted themselves in ways that are interesting. And so within venture capital, I think like, Fred and Andy are probably the two I know best over there. USV has always been that for us. Brad Feld and some of the other folks at, Foundry Group have always been interesting to us for that. There's been a few other people who I've always sought out the guidance from, not because we want to follow their path or be the 2.0 version of them or be the junior version of them, but because we find that the questions that they ask themselves as firm builders are very interesting, and they help us ask the same questions of Homebrew. And sometimes our answers are similar to theirs, and sometimes our answers are different from them. So that's, I do think, Homebrew, I mean, to sort of do a little mini history lesson, Homebrew is named after the Homebrew Computer Club, which was a group of, PC enthusiasts, tech geeks, who in the late 70s, early 80s used to like hang out in Palo Alto on Stanford's campus and just like build PCs, talk shop. It's where Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak met. So if Homebrew Computer Club hadn't existed, Apple, probably wouldn't exist, certainly not in the form it took, as well as many other people who started various hardware companies or other things that influence the technology industry. I was a history major in undergrad, and I've always thought that like what's wonderful about our industry is that we're so focused on what's next, what's next, what's next. But I think it's important to like remember that a lot of who we are comes that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. To remember even though this is an industry that's always been about moving quickly, and it's not just about money now, it's always been about money, but it is about the love of technology. And so we sort of like pay a little bit of a tribute, to those roots with our name, even though, we as much as anybody are looking forward, not backwards.
My last question might sound a bit cheeky, but
Oh, I'm excited
when
now. Let me have
when
it.
when we look at, or when you look at the people who are on the top or in the top level of investors, founders, that didn't have the typical rise and fall because of be, becoming weird or crazy or anything. What would you say are the characteristics of the people who stayed on top of their game for decades? Not only like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, but really decades.
That's such an interesting question. I mean, we could probably, you could spend, podcast just about that. So I don't want to, sometimes you never really know people. You only know some persona of them. And I don't want to put people, on a therapy couch and analyze them. I guess what I'd say that I've observed of the people who I believe fit that definition and who I really admire, maybe people like Mitch Kapor, who started Lotus, more recently, people like Jeff Lawson, who started a bunch of companies, including Twilio. And I really admire people who, Jeff took Twilio public. I really admire founders who take their companies public and remain as public company CEOs for a while. Jeff should still be there. I think he only left because of some board and investor activism, but I have a tremendous respect for him, and I think that company, it's an incredible company. I think that they care and love about something other than just the typical scorecard, the typical KPIs of the business world. They know that like revenue, growth, magazine covers, like all these things, are sort of either direct, leading or lagging indicators of success, but they don't turn them into the their own definitions of success. They are they think about impact. They think about their teams. They think about generosity. They think about a legacy. And for me, it's kind of that looking out and seeing the world beyond your company and knowing that first and foremost, you have to run a great business, but that ultimately that business needs to stand for something and that you as an individual stand for something. I don't think it's, this question now about, well, is that politics or social issues or so on and so forth. Like companies don't have to stand for all those things. I'm not a believer that it's incumbent upon every company to have a voice on every issue. But I do think, as a human being, you get to decide how you want to use your power. And the folks who I think I admire most in our industry who have achieved levels of economic success, of the respect of the peers, notoriety, are somehow also, paying that forward in ways that, increase the span of their influence rather than, behaving in a way that I'd say is more, about scarcity and pulling power towards them. I don't know, maybe you could go, maybe they all have, some similar, sort of experience that led them to that, or maybe they had just, good mentors, good role models themselves. But for me, that's one of the things that attracts me to people, that um, they use their success, their power, their influence to expand and empower others versus sort of, maintain and increase, their own power. We're all so lucky, so fortunate. I mean, I started in tech. I was born, Malcolm Gladwell talks about sort of the 10,000 hours, how do you become an expert? But like what people also forget is that it has to be the 10,000 hours during the right period of time, right? So the Beatles became the Beatles, not just because they had 10,000 hours, but because it was during the dawn of the, electric guitar and, rock and roll. Like Bill Gates became Bill Gates, not just because he started programming early and had 10,000 hours, but it was because it was at the dawn of the PC. I felt like I'm so lucky. I had my 10,000 hours, the beginning of the home PC and the consumer internet, and like got to see that industry turn from underdogs to now. I don't think anybody would argue that like the technology industry is the most powerful industry in the world. And, what's the line from Spider-Man? With great power comes great responsibility. That would be my hope for all the people who's listening to you who have started companies or who want to start companies, that even though you might feel like an underdog, we're all trying just to make sure our company survives another day, that like collectively we do have great power. And so thus we also have great responsibility. And like Homebrew is named, after people 50 years ago who, in many ways, started what we are all benefiting from today. Like we should be doing things that for, 1, 5, 50 years from now, create, a world where the next generation can build what they want to build.
I think these are the perfect words to end the episode. I will definitely link to your blog, your LinkedIn, and Homebrew in the show notes. Feel free, everyone, to check it out. There are amazing pieces on the blog, for example, that I really enjoyed reading and thought, okay, you can just read them instead of us talking about them right now. Hunter, it's been such a pleasure, and I really enjoy your perspective. Thanks for taking the time. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's been great meeting you. These questions always make me think a little bit. They challenge, sort of what do I actually believe versus what do I just say? And so I'll be thinking about this as well.
Thank you.